Love Under Fire, Luther's Safe Conduct in Jeopardy. The Pope's representatives again demanded that the Emperor disregard the Reformer's safe conduct. The Rhine should receive his ashes as it received those of John Huss a century ago. But princes of Germany, those sworn enemies of Luther, protested such a violation of public faith. They pointed to the disasters that had followed the death of Huss. They did not dare to bring upon Germany a repetition of those terrible evils. In answer to the disgraceful proposal, Charles said, "Though honor and faith were banished from all the world, they ought to find a refuge in the hearts of princes." Luther's papal enemies continued to urge him to deal with the Reformer as Sigismund had dealt with Huss. But remembering the scene when in public assembly Huss had pointed to his chains and reminded the monarch of his pledges of safe conduct, Charles V declared, "I would not like to blush like Sigismund." Yet Charles deliberately rejected the truths that Luther presented. He would not step out of the path of custom to walk in the ways of truth and righteousness. Because his fathers did, he also would uphold the papacy. In this way, he refused to accept light that went beyond what his fathers had received. Many today cling to the tradition of their ancestors. When the Lord sends additional light, they refuse to accept it because their fathers had not received it. God will not approve us if we look to our fathers to decide our duty instead of searching the word of truth for ourselves. We are accountable for the additional light that now shines on us from the Word of God. Through Luther, divine power had spoken to the Emperor and princes of Germany. God's Spirit pleaded for the last time with many in that assembly. As Pilate had done centuries before, so Charles V yielded to worldly pride and decided to reject the light of truth. The threats against Luther circulated widely, stirring up excitement throughout the city. Knowing the deceitful cruelty of Rome, many friends resolved to prevent the Reformer from being sacrificed. Hundreds of nobles pledged to protect him. Signs were posted on the gates of houses and in public places, some condemning Luther and others defending him. One of them carried the significant words, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child." Popular enthusiasm in Luther's favor convinced the emperor and the assembly that any injustice to him would endanger the peace of the empire and the stability of the throne. Efforts for compromise with Rome. Frederick of Saxony carefully concealed his real feelings toward the Reformer. At the same time, he guarded Luther with constant vigilance, watching his movements and those of his enemies. But many others did not try to hide their sympathy with Luther. The doctor's little room, wrote Spalatin, could not contain all the visitors who presented themselves. Even those who had no faith in his doctrines could not help admiring the integrity that led him to risk death rather than violate his conscience. Some tried earnestly to get Luther to agree to a compromise with Rome. Nobles and princes told him that if he set up his own judgment against the church and the councils, he would be banished from the empire and have no defense. They again urged him to submit to the emperor's judgment, then he would have nothing to fear. In reply, he said, "I consent with all my heart that the emperor, the princes, and even the meanest Christian should examine and judge my works, but on one condition, that they take the word of God for their standard. Humanity has nothing to do but to obey it." To another appeal, he said, "I consent to renounce my safe conduct. I place my person and my life in the emperor's hands, but the word of God, never." He said he was willing to submit to a general council, but only if the council were required to decide according to the Scriptures. In what concerns the Word of God and the faith, every Christian is as good a judge as the Pope, even if 1,000,000 councils side with the Pope. Both friends and enemies were finally convinced that further effort to reconcile the two sides would be useless. If the reformer had given in on a single point, Satan and his angels would have gained the victory. But his unwavering firmness was the means of freeing the Church. The influence of this one man who dared to think and act for himself was to affect the Church and the world, not only in his own time, but in all future generations. The emperor soon commanded Luther to return home. His condemnation would quickly follow. Threatening clouds hung over his path. But as he left Worms, his heart was full of joy and praise. After he left, Luther wanted to make it clear that his firmness was not rebellion. He wrote to the emperor, "I am ready most earnestly to obey your majesty, in honor or in dishonor, in life or in death, and with no exception but the word of God, by which man lives." When eternal interests are involved, God does not want one person to submit to another. This is because such submission in spiritual matters is a real worship, and it ought to be given only to the Creator. On the journey from Worms, princely church leaders welcomed the excommunicated monk, and civil rulers honored the man whom the emperor had denounced. They urged him to preach, and despite the imperial ban, he again entered the pulpit. "I never pledged myself to chain up the word of God," he said, "nor will I." He had not been away from Worms very long when Catholic leaders got the emperor to issue an edict against him. Luther was denounced as Satan himself, under the form of a man and dressed in a monk's clothing. As soon as his safe conduct expired, everyone was forbidden to shelter him, give him food or drink, or help him by word or act. He was to be delivered to the authorities, his followers also to be imprisoned, and their property taken. His writings were to be destroyed, and finally, anyone who dared to act contrary to this decree was included in its condemnation. The Elector of Saxony and the princes most friendly to Luther had left Worms soon after Luther, and the emperor's decree received approval from the assembly that remained. The supporters of Rome were overjoyed. They thought the fate of the Reformation was sealed.